I want to explain what a trail camera actually is, because I think most people picture something more sophisticated than it actually is. A trail camera is a small weatherproof box, usually strapped to a tree, with a passive infrared sensor that detects motion and heat, and a camera that takes a photo or short video when the sensor triggers. They're used by hunters, mostly, but also by wildlife researchers like me. You strap one to a tree at roughly chest height, aim it at a game trail or a clearing or a water source, and you leave it. Weeks later, sometimes months later, you come back, pull the memory card, and you find out what's been walking past that tree while you weren't there. Most of what's on a memory card is nothing: deer, raccoons, branches moving in the wind, which trigger the sensor and produce a photo of nothing at all. Out of 1,000 images, maybe 20 are useful. That's the job, sorting through enormous quantities of nothing to find the small amount of something. My name is Renata Voss. I'm 38. I'm a wildlife biologist, and for the past 11 years, I've worked on long-term monitoring projects, the kind of research that doesn't produce dramatic results in any given year, but that becomes valuable specifically because it's long-term. Population trends, range shifts, the slow stuff. I currently manage a camera network in a roughly 40 square mile section of national forest in the mountains, part of a study that's been running in one form or another since the 1970s. That's the detail that matters. Since the 1970s. The study predates me by decades. I inherited it from my predecessor, who inherited it from his predecessor, going back through at least 4 biologists before me. The camera network has changed over the years, from film cameras on timers to early digital units to the modern infrared trail cameras we use now. But the locations of many of the camera stations haven't changed. Some of these stations have been photographing the same spot in the forest with whatever technology was current for 50 years. One of those stations is on Ridge 7. I want to tell you about Ridge 7. Ridge 7 is the internal name for one of about 60 camera stations in our network. The naming convention is just sequential. Ridges and drainages were numbered when the study was set up in the 70s, and the names stuck. Ridge 7 is a narrow forested ridge at moderate elevation, about a 90-minute hike from the nearest trailhead, no maintained trail for the last 40 minutes of it. It's not a place anyone goes except researchers. The camera at Ridge 7 is positioned on a large Douglas fir, aimed across a small clearing toward a game trail that runs along the spine of the ridge. It's a good location, lots of activity, deer and elk and the occasional bear, and we'd gotten some good cougar photos there over the years, which was useful for the study. I'd been managing the network for about 3 years when I started noticing something in the Ridge 7 data. Each camera station gets visited roughly every 6 to 8 weeks. You swap the memory card, check the batteries, make sure the camera's still aimed correctly, and move on. Over the course of a year, a station like Ridge 7 might generate 2,000 or 3,000 images, the vast majority of which are exactly what you'd expect: wildlife, weather, false triggers. But once a year, always in the same general window, the first week of October, there was an image that didn't fit. The first time I noticed it, I almost deleted it without a second thought, because that's how most of this work goes. You're moving fast through thousands of images, and anything that looks like an obvious false trigger gets discarded. The image was taken at 11:58 p.m. on October 3rd. It showed the clearing, lit by the camera's infrared flash, empty of any animal. But standing at the edge of the frame, at the tree line, was a person. I want to describe the image carefully, because I've looked at it many times since, and the details matter. Infrared trail camera photos at night are black and white, grainy, and have a specific quality. Everything illuminated by the camera's own infrared flash. which has a limited range, so the foreground is bright and the background fades to black quickly. The clearing in this photo was empty. The game trail was empty. But at the very edge of the illuminated area, where the clearing met the tree line, there was a human figure. It was facing the camera. Standing still, trail cameras have a brief shutter delay, and any motion usually shows as blur, but this figure was sharp, meaning it had been standing still when the sensor triggered. It was wearing what looked like a heavy jacket or coat, dark, and I couldn't make out details of the face, partly because of the distance, partly because of how infrared flash renders human skin, which often appears strangely pale and flat, almost featureless. My first assumption was the obvious one, a hiker, or more likely a hunter, since it was early October and archery season for elk had just opened. People do occasionally wander into our camera stations, even the remote ones, especially during hunting season. It was unusual to be out at midnight, but not impossible. Some hunters do still hunt or scout at night, or it could simply be someone lost or moving back to camp after dark. I made a note, human presence detected, Ridge 7, 10/3, 2358, which is standard practice. We log any human activity at camera stations because it can affect wildlife behavior and is relevant to the study. And I moved on. 2,000 more images to get through that week. It wasn't until almost a year later, going through the next batch of Ridge 7 images, that I found another one. Same camera, same clearing, same treeline position, more or less. A human figure facing the camera, standing still. Taken at 11:54 p.m. on October 3rd. I sat with that for a while before I did anything about it. Here's what I told myself, and I want to be fair to my own reasoning at the time. October 3rd is the opening week of archery elk season in this unit. It is entirely plausible that hunters scout the same areas year after year, particularly areas with good camera-documented elk activity. And if our cameras were getting good footage, that meant the area was good hunting, and word travels in hunting communities. A hunter or group of hunters returning to the same productive spot on the same date, during the opening days of the same season, year after year, isn't actually that strange. People are creatures of habit, especially about things they care about. What was strange, what I couldn't quite get past, was the time. Almost midnight. And the posture, standing still, facing the camera directly, both years, in almost the same spot. I went back through our archives. Our digital archive went back about 15 years at that point, covering the period since digital cameras had replaced film at most stations. I pulled every image from Ridge 7, every October, going back as far as the digital record went. The figure was there. Not every year, I want to be precise about this. Out of 15 years of digital images, the figure appeared in 11 of them. Always in the first week of October. Always at night, between roughly 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. Always at the tree line, facing the camera, standing still. The 4 years it didn't appear, I checked the camera logs for those periods. In 2 of those years, the camera had malfunctioned and recorded no images at all during that window. A dead battery in one case and a memory card error in the other. In the other 2 years, the camera had been temporarily relocated for maintenance and wasn't pointed at the same clearing during early October. Every year the camera was working and pointed at that clearing during the first week of October. The figure was there. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it's the responsible thing to explain, even though in hindsight some of it embarrasses me. I went to my predecessor, the biologist I'd taken over the network from, who had retired but still lived in the area and occasionally consulted on the study. His name was Frank Tully, and he'd run the network for 19 years before me. I showed him the images, all 11 of them side by side, and I asked him if he'd ever noticed anything like this. Frank looked at the images for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I know about that." I asked him what he knew. He told me that he'd found the same pattern years earlier, going back through the digital archive the same way I had. He'd also gone further than I had at that point. He'd dug into the film archive, the photos from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, before the network went digital. Those images were stored as physical prints and negatives in boxes at the agency's regional office, organized by station and year, going back to when the study began. I went through every October for Ridge 7, all the way back to 1974, he said. Same thing. Not every year. Cameras back then were on timers, not motion sensors, so a lot of years there's just no exposure anywhere near midnight. But when there was an exposure near midnight in the first week of October, he tapped the photo. There he is, he. I asked him how he knew it was a he. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The early ones are clearer. Film resolution, older cameras, different flash setup. Some of those old shots, you can see more than you can in the digital ones. Come by the house. I'll show you what I kept." Frank Tully's house was about 40 minutes from the trailhead, a small place with a detached garage that he used as an office and workshop. He had a filing cabinet dedicated entirely to what he called, without any apparent irony, the Ridge 7 file. Inside were photocopies and a few original prints, going back to 1976, the earliest year, he said, that the Ridge 7 station had captured a clear nighttime exposure in the relevant window. He laid them out on his workbench in chronological order. The 1976 print was the clearest of all of them, because the film cameras of that era, when they worked, captured more detail than the early digital units that came decades later. It showed the same clearing, less overgrown than in modern photos, the trees smaller, and the same figure at the tree line. In this print, you could see more. The figure was a man, middle-aged or older based on posture, wearing what looked like a wool coat and a hat with a brim. The kind of hat that wasn't unusual for outdoorsmen in that era, but that you don't see much anymore. His face was turned toward the camera, and while the image wasn't sharp enough to make out features in detail, you could see that his eyes appeared to be open, and that he appeared to be looking directly at the lens. I tried to figure out who he was, Frank said. Spent a stupid amount of time on it, honestly. Talked to old-timers, looked at old hunting camp records. There used to be an outfitters camp about 2 miles from Ridge 7, operated from the 50s until it closed in the early 70s. I found one thing. He handed me a photocopy of a newspaper clipping, a short article from a regional paper, dated October 11th, 1973. The headline read, "Hunter missing near redacted ridge, search continues into second week." The article was brief, the way these articles often are. A man named Walter Inkster, 61 years old, a longtime client of the outfitters camp near Ridge 7, had gone out alone on the morning of October 3rd, 1973, to scout for the opening of archery season the following week. He hadn't returned. A search had been conducted over the following 10 days. The article was reporting on the search's continuation, not its outcome. Frank had a second clipping, dated about 3 weeks later, much shorter. The search had been called off. Walter Inkster had not been found. The article noted that the terrain in the area was rugged and heavily timbered, and that searchers believed he had most likely suffered a fall or medical event in a remote location. His body was never recovered. The outfitters' camp closed the next year, Frank said, 1974. Same year the camera study started. I don't know if that's connected. Probably not. The study started for its own reasons, regional funding, nothing to do with the camp. But the timing always struck me. I looked at the date on the first newspaper clipping again. October 3rd, 1973. The day Walter Inkster went out and didn't come back. And the first clear photograph in Frank's file, the 1976 print, the clearest of all of them, had been taken on October 3rd, just before midnight. He goes out scouting, I said slowly, the day before opening day. October 3rd. Every year, someone stands at that tree line on October 3rd, around midnight, looking at the camera. Frank nodded. Scouting, he said. That's what I always thought too. Like he never stopped. Like wherever he is, whatever he is, October comes around and he goes back out to do the thing he was doing when whatever happened to him happened. I drove home that night thinking about Walter Inkster scouting the same ridge for 50 years. Here's what stayed with me more than anything else. In every photo across nearly 5 decades, he was facing the camera, looking at it directly. Not wandering past, not caught mid-stride, not unaware. Looking at the lens, the way you look at something you know is there. I went back through the rest of Frank's file. He had more recent entries too. He'd kept tracking it even after retirement, through me, asking around informally about whether the Ridge 7 camera was still in the same spot, still pointed the same direction. I didn't want it to stop being documented, he told me. Seemed important that someone kept watching, even if he stopped. Even if it's just a camera. Even if no one's ever there to see it happen in person. I asked him if he'd ever gone to Ridge 7 himself, on October 3rd, to see it directly. He looked at me for a long moment. Once, he said, 1998. I hiked up there, set up a tent about 30 yards off, and waited. What happened? Nothing, he said. I sat there from 10 p.m. to about 1 in the morning. Nothing. No sound, no movement, nothing at the tree line. I checked the camera afterward. There was no exposure for that night at all. The sensor never triggered. He let that sit for a moment. But the next year, he said, 1999, I wasn't there. And the camera caught him. Same as always. Like, I don't know. Like he doesn't come if someone's there in person. Only the camera. Only when nobody's watching, except the lens. I've thought about that distinction a great deal in the years since. Only when nobody's watching, except the lens. A trail camera occupies a strange category. It's a kind of presence that isn't a presence, a recording device left in a place specifically so that a person doesn't have to be there. In a sense, it's the opposite of being watched. It's evidence collected in your absence to be reviewed later by someone who wasn't there when it happened. I wondered, after talking to Frank, whether that mattered. Whether Walter Inkster, if it was Walter Inkster, and at this point I'd stopped putting if in front of most of my thoughts about it. Returned to that clearing every October not because anyone was there, but because the camera was. Because the camera meant that, eventually, someone would look. Even if it was months later. Even if it was a biologist named Renata sorting through 2,000 images of deer, looking for the 20 that mattered. Maybe that was enough. Maybe for 50 years, the fact that someone would eventually look at the photograph, even long after the moment had passed, was a kind of being found. A kind of search that never officially ended, because somewhere on a memory card, the evidence was still being collected. I don't know if that's right. I don't have a framework for evaluating whether it's right. But it's the explanation that has stayed with me, because it's the only one that makes the pattern feel less like a haunting and more like, I don't have a better word for it, an appointment. Something he keeps. Something that, as far as I can tell, has never once been missed, except in the years our equipment failed, or the 1 year someone was actually there to see it. I still manage the camera network. Ridge 7 is still one of our stations. Same tree, same angle, same clearing. We've been careful, since I learned all this, to keep that camera's position consistent. We don't move it during maintenance windows that would put us there in early October. I'm not sure if that precaution matters, but it costs us nothing to take it, and Frank seemed to think it mattered, so I've kept doing it. Every year, I go through the Ridge 7 images from the October retrieval first, before anything else. I look for the date, October 3rd, the window between 11:45 and 12:15. Most years now, I find him. A few years I don't. Equipment issues, mostly. The same kinds of failures Frank documented decades ago. When I find the image, I do something that I started doing a few years ago and haven't told anyone else about, including Frank, though I suspect he'd understand. I save it. Not in the research archive, in a separate folder on my own computer that now has almost 50 years of images in it, going back to Frank's photocopies of the original 1976 print. I've scanned everything he had. I've added every year since. It's the most complete record that exists of Walter Inkster, a man who went scouting on October 3rd, 1973, and never came home, and who has been scouting on October 3rd every year since, for an audience of one camera and whoever eventually looks at what it sees. I open that folder every October after I find the new image, and I look through all of them, 50 years of the same man, at the same tree line, at the same time of night, looking at the same spot where, eventually, someone would be looking back. And then I close the folder, and I go back to sorting through the rest of the images, the deer, the elk, the branches moving in the wind, because that's the job. Most of what's on a memory card is nothing. But some of it isn't. And I think, after everything, that's the part of this story that matters most to me. That for 50 years, the only thing standing between Walter Inkster and being completely, finally lost, erased, the way the article said, by rugged and heavily timbered terrain, has been a small weatherproof box strapped to a tree, doing exactly what it was built to do. Watching. And waiting for someone to come back and look. People assume that cartography is a settled science, that maps are just accurate representations of what's there, updated when something changes. And mostly that's true. But maps are made by people, copied by people, and corrected by people, and anywhere there are people, there's room for error. Most of my career has been spent finding those errors. My name is Paulin Ape. I'm 46. I work as a cartographic data analyst for a regional mapping authority, the kind of organization that maintains official survey records, reconciles them with satellite and aerial data, and produces the baseline maps that everything else gets built on. GPS systems, emergency services routing, property records. A lot of it traces back, eventually, to data that people like me maintain and correct. Most of my job is unglamorous. I find a road on an old survey that's been digitized incorrectly, a curve that's too sharp, a name that's misspelled, a property line that's off by a few feet, and I correct it, and I document why, and I move on. Errors accumulate over a century of map-making in predictable ways. Bad transcriptions, outdated surveys that never got updated, roads that were planned but never built, roads that were built and later abandoned but never removed from the record. I want to tell you about one specific error because it wasn't like the others, and because I spent the better part of 2 years trying to understand it, and because I don't think I ever fully did. It started with a routine reconciliation project. Our authority was updating the rural road network for a county in the eastern part of our region, cross-referencing current aerial imagery against the official survey baseline, which in some areas hadn't been fully updated since the 1960s. Most of the discrepancies were exactly what you'd expect. Roads that had been paved, roads that had been abandoned, and were now just faint traces in farmland, the normal slow churn of rural infrastructure. But in one section, a sparsely populated area of forest and farmland, maybe 12 square miles, there was a road on the baseline survey that didn't appear in the aerial imagery at all. That happens. Roads get abandoned, grow over, disappear. Normally, you just mark it as removed and move on. Except this road appeared on every survey going back to 1911. And it had never appeared on any aerial photograph, ever, for as long as aerial photography of that area existed, which was since the 1940s. I need to explain how official surveys get made and maintained, because the specifics matter here. A road like this, a minor rural road, unpaved, low traffic, would have originally been recorded by a field surveyor, someone physically walking or driving the route with surveying equipment, recording its position, and submitting that data to be incorporated into the county's official map. That survey then becomes the baseline. Future updates are usually done remotely, using aerial photography and now satellite imagery cross-referenced against the baseline. If a road from the baseline doesn't appear in the aerial imagery, the standard assumption is that it's been abandoned and overgrown, and it gets flagged for ground truthing. Someone physically checks, eventually, when resources allow, or it just gets carried forward indefinitely as an unverified feature, because ground truthing every minor discrepancy in a rural county isn't resourced. This particular road, in our internal system, it was just labeled by a feature ID, but I started calling it, privately, the Birch Hollow Road, because that was the name of the area it ran through according to the 1911 survey, had apparently been carried forward, unverified, for over a century. Nobody had ever ground truthed it. It had just been copied from survey to survey, decade after decade, an unbroken chain of cartographic inheritance, because that's how these systems work. You don't resurvey everything from scratch. You update what's changed and carry forward what hasn't been flagged. The 1911 survey showed it clearly. A road, about 1.4 miles long, running from a county road through Birch Hollow to what was labeled on that survey as a school. By the 1940s aerial photographs, there was no road visible at that location. Just forest. I pulled every aerial photograph of that area that existed, going back to the earliest available from 1947. Forest consistently in every available image for 70+ years. No trace of a road, no clearing, no different vegetation pattern, nothing that would indicate a road had ever been there and grown over, which usually leaves at least a subtle signature in vegetation even decades later. And yet every ground survey since 1911, 1911, 1924, 1938, 1956, 1971, 1989, and a partial resurvey in 2003 had recorded that road as present. My first assumption, the boring and almost certainly correct one, was transcription error. Someone in 1924 had copied the 1911 survey without actually rechecking that specific feature, and every subsequent survey had copied from the previous one, and the road had simply never been re-verified for over a century. This happens. It's embarrassing when it's discovered, but it happens, and it's exactly the kind of thing my job exists to catch. I went to find the original survey field notes, not just the finished maps, but the actual notebooks that field surveyors kept, which our authority retains in an archive because they are sometimes needed for legal disputes about property boundaries. If the road had been copied without verification since 1911, the field notes for every survey after 1911 should show no actual fieldwork for that specific area. The surveyors would have just transcribed from the existing map. The 1924 field notes had an entry for that road. Bramwell, RD. 1.4 mi, surveyed, condition fair, school at terminus operational, 11 students enrolled per teacher, Miss A. Voss. That's not a transcription. That's a field observation. Someone had physically been there in 1924, had seen the road, had seen the school, had apparently spoken to the teacher and gotten an enrollment figure. This wasn't a copied error. Someone had verified this road's existence in 1924, 13 years after the 1911 survey, and recorded new information about it. I checked 1938. Same thing, a field note, this time briefer. Bramwell RD, condition poor, school closed, consolidated to District 4 per county records. Road still in use, local traffic. 1956, Bramwell RD, gravel, maintained by township. 2 residences served. 1971, Bramwell RD, unmaintained, 1 residence J. Hollies, elderly, lifetime resident, declined relocation per township records. 1989, Bramwell RD, impassable by vehicle, foot traffic only. Residence vacant, J. Hollies deceased per township records, 1984. Road recommended for removal from active maintenance schedule. Retain on survey pending future development. 2003, partial resurvey. Bramwell RD noted as present, but heavily overgrown. Surveyor noted difficulty locating road bed. GPS coordinates recorded from what surveyor believed to be the road's historical alignment based on a break in canopy density, visible from elevated position. 7 surveys. 7 sets of field notes, each describing a real place with real details. A school, a teacher's name, an enrollment number, a consolidation, a resident named J. Hollies who declined relocation and died in 1984. And not one of these surveys corresponds to anything visible in 70+ years of aerial photography. I started at this point, treating it less like a cartographic error and more like a historical research question. If a road, a school, and a series of residents had existed and been documented by professional surveyors as recently as 2003, there should be other records, township records, school records, census data, something that wasn't just our survey archive. I found the school first. District records for the county showed a 1-room schoolhouse, Birch Hollow School, operational from approximately 1903 to 1936, when it was consolidated with a larger district school due to declining enrollment. The teacher in 1924 was listed as Agnes Voss, matching the field notes, Miss A. Voss, who had taught there from 1919 to 1931. I found J. Hollies. Township tax records showed a property, listed by parcel number, on Bramwell Road, owned by a James Hollies from 1958 until his death in 1984, at which point the property reverted to the township for unpaid back taxes, since he had no heirs that the township could locate. The township's own records noted that the property was inaccessible by standard maintenance vehicle, and that, after 1984, no further action taken. Property considered abandoned, low priority. All of this was real. Documented, cross-referenced, consistent across multiple independent record-keeping systems. The school district, the township, our own survey archive. A road had existed. A community, small as it was, had existed along it. And every official record of that place, for over a century, was completely absent from any image taken from above. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the road and the school and James Hollies didn't exist. They obviously did. There's too much independent documentation for that. What I'm saying is that something about that specific location, throughout the entire period for which aerial photography exists, every single year from 1947 onward, has never shown a road, a clearing, a structure, or any trace of human habitation, in a location where multiple independent ground-based records insist all of those things were present, including as late as 1989. At this point, I did something that wasn't really part of my job. I drove out there. The location was about 2 hours from where I lived. I went on a Saturday in late April with the 1989 field notes description and the 2003 GPS coordinates and a handheld GPS unit of my own. The county road that the 1911 survey showed Bramwell Road branching off from still existed. That part of the map was accurate, current, easily confirmed. I parked at the approximate location where Bramwell Road should have branched off, according to every survey since 1911. There was forest. Mixed hardwood, the kind of forest that in this region is mostly second growth, meaning it grew back after farmland was abandoned sometime in the past century. Second growth forest has a specific character. The trees are more uniform in age and spacing than old growth forest because they all started growing around the same time after whatever was there before was cleared away. I want to tell you something about this forest that I noticed almost immediately and that I've thought about constantly since. The trees were uniform, consistent with second growth, consistent with land that had been cleared at some point and allowed to regrow. But there was no clearing pattern. No road bed, no foundation outlines, no old fence lines, none of the subtle topographic and vegetative signatures that even heavily overgrown former settlements almost always leave behind, visible to a trained eye even when invisible to a casual one. I've walked dozens of abandoned settlement sites in this region as part of my work. They all have a texture to them, a flatness where a yard used to be, an unnatural straightness where a road used to run, ornamental plants like lilacs or dahlias that outlive the houses they were planted next to by a century. This forest had none of that. It was uniform in every direction. According to my GPS, I was standing within 100 feet of where Bramwell Road should have run, where the school should have stood, where James Hollies' house should have been until 1984. I walked the 2003 surveyor's GPS-recorded alignment, the break in canopy density he'd used to estimate the road's position. I want to tell you, there was, in fact, a very faint difference in the canopy along that line. Slightly younger trees, by my inexperienced estimate, in a roughly linear strip about 10 feet wide, running through the otherwise uniform forest for as far as I could trace it before the underbrush became difficult to move through. It wasn't a road, but it was something. A line through the forest where the trees were slightly younger than the trees around them. I followed it for almost half a mile, and then I found the foundation. It was small, consistent, with a one-room schoolhouse. Stone mostly collapsed, mostly buried under a century of leaf litter and the slow creep of forest floor, but unmistakably a foundation. A rectangular outline, maybe 20 feet by 30, with what had clearly been a chimney base at one end. It was real. It was there. The school had existed, exactly where the 1924 field notes said it would be, exactly where Agnes Voss had taught 11 students. And it had never appeared in a single aerial photograph in 77 years of available imagery, of an area I was now standing in, with my hand on a stone foundation that I could touch. I sat on that foundation for a long time. I'm going to tell you what I thought about, because I think it's the heart of this whole thing, even though I can't resolve it. Aerial photography and ground surveying are two different ways of confirming that something exists. For most of human history, only ground surveying was possible. Someone had to physically go somewhere and look at it. Aerial photography is relatively recent, and it has a specific characteristic. It captures a place from a perspective that no person standing in that place ever experiences. It sees the whole area at once, from above, the way no one on the ground ever does. For 77 years, that perspective, the view from above, had never included this place. but the view from the ground, repeatedly across a century, by different surveyors with no apparent connection to each other, working decades apart, had. A teacher had been there. A man named James Hollies had lived there, alone, until 1984, declining relocation, dying there, his property reverting to a township that considered it low priority and never went back. I thought about what it would be like to live somewhere that, as far as anyone looking down from above could tell, simply wasn't there. To exist only for the people who came on foot or by the road itself, a road that itself had never been visible from above. I thought about James Hollies, specifically. 80-some years old probably by 1984, alone on a road that the township had stopped maintaining, in a house that no aerial photograph had ever shown, dying there, with nobody coming to check, because the records said the property was inaccessible and low priority. And, I realized, sitting on that foundation, because from above, there was nothing there to check on. I want to tell you about the last thing that happened that day, because it's the part I have the least explanation for, and I've decided not to try to manufacture one. I was walking back toward my car, following the faint line of younger trees that I'd identified as the road's former alignment. It was late afternoon by then, the light starting to slant low through the canopy. I was maybe 10 minutes from where I'd parked. I heard ahead of me on the path footsteps. Slow, regular, the cadence of someone walking at an unhurried pace. Coming toward me. I stopped. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds, and then they stopped too, not abruptly, the way they would if someone had noticed me and frozen, but the way footsteps stop when someone simply arrives somewhere and stands still. I called out, "Hello." Nothing. The forest was very quiet, the specific quiet of late afternoon in deep woods, when birds go still before evening activity picks up. I stood there for what felt like a long time, and then I continued walking more slowly toward where the footsteps had stopped. I didn't feel afraid, exactly. Or rather, I felt afraid the way you feel afraid of something that doesn't seem to want anything from you, which is a specific and almost manageable kind of fear. When I reached the spot, my GPS later confirmed it was within 30 feet of where the 1989 field notes placed James Hollies' house. There was nothing. No foundation. Even if his house had been there, it had left less trace than the school. Just forest, uniform, the younger trees of the road line passing through it and continuing on toward the county road. I stood there and I said, because it seemed like the only thing to say, and because I meant it, "I'm sorry nobody came." I don't know what I expected. Nothing happened, no sound, no further footsteps, nothing. But the quality of the quiet changed, very slightly. The specific stillness of birds before evening gave way to ordinary forest sound. A few calls, the wind in the canopy, the normal noise of a living place. As if something that had been holding its breath had let it out. I walked the rest of the way to my car, without incident. I filed my findings the following week, and I want to tell you what I recommended, because I think it matters. I did not recommend removing Bramwell Road from the survey. Standard procedure, given 77 years of aerial non-confirmation, would have been to flag it for removal. Mark it as a historical error, note that it doesn't correspond to any verifiable current feature, and let it quietly drop out of the next revision, the way thousands of obsolete features drop out of survey revisions every year. Instead, I recommended something our authority has a mechanism for but rarely uses, designating it as a documented historical feature with an annotation explaining its history. The school, Agnes Voss and her 11 students, the consolidation in 1936, James Hollies and his refusal to relocate, his death in 1984, the township's abandonment of the property. I wrote all of it up, cross-referenced against every record I'd found, and I included my own observation, carefully worded, professionally framed. that the foundation of the schoolhouse is still physically present and could be verified by anyone who walked the historical alignment. My recommendation was approved with minimal discussion by a reviewing committee that I suspect found the whole thing more curious than significant. Bramwell Road is still on our official survey. It still doesn't appear in any aerial photograph. But there's now a permanent annotation in our system that explains what it was and who lived there, and that the place is real even if it's never been visible from above. I think about James Hollis sometimes, a man who lived his whole life, as far as I can tell, in one place, on a road that the world above had stopped being able to see, who refused to leave when the township asked him to relocate, who died there alone, and whose property was filed away as low priority, because nobody could confirm, from the only perspective anyone bothered to check anymore, that there was anything there to prioritize. I don't know what the footsteps were. I don't know what was holding its breath in that forest, or what changed when I said I was sorry. I'm a cartographer, not anything else, and I don't have a framework for that part of it. But I know the road is real. I know the school was real, and the teacher, and her 11 students, and James Hollis, and the house that left no foundation because maybe, by the time it was empty, there was no one left who needed it to be findable from above, only someone who might, someday, come on foot. The annotation is still in our system. Anyone who looks up that section of the survey will find it. A road, a school, a name, Bramwell Road, Birch Hollow School, James Hollis, 1984, and a note explaining that this place exists and existed and was real, regardless of what 80 years of cameras pointed at the ground from the sky were ever able to see. Some places, I've come to think, were never meant to be seen from above. They were only ever meant to be walked to. And someone, eventually, has to walk there